I did receive some actual physical hate mail. Thankfully, also, I received a lot of really interesting responses about how, like, they thought it was an amazing thing that the Catholic Church was interested in this kind of dialogue.
It's like trails and blazes with the metal getting wrong, sticking labels on lists on. Fake ladies and males get their shit on, made up and murdered like women gliding with their wings gone.
Yo, what is going down? Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we can bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And I'm Troy Polidori.
And this week we have a guest on, Dean Detloff from the Magnificast podcast, co-host there, and he's also a junior member at the Institute for Christian Studies who specializes in work kind of at the intersection between religion and leftist politics. So we're going to chat with him about everything from an article that he wrote about, well, it's, I guess, rhetorically, and is it inflammatory? It's got a good title to it, The Catholic Case for Communism. It'll definitely trend on social media, and it did. It caused a little bit of a shitstorm, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll chat with him about that, but then we go into all kinds of other things, talking about religion, Marxism, Christianity, Protestantism, Catholicism, the social gospel. We get all kinds of resources about people to look into, liberation theology, the Pope, etc., etc., etc. And what is God? We even talk about that big, grand question, the being of being.
Yeah, I wonder who asked that question, Austin.
I don't know, some asshole probably. Some neurotic asshole who needs to know about the essence of the divine. But yeah, so stick around for that. That's coming up.
But before that, we do want to mention that if you want to support the podcast, you can at patreon.com/owlsatdawn. We have several tiers of support there that you can join, and you can get goodies such as the monthly newsletter that we send out every month, which has extra shitty minutes, extra sticky leaves, some books we're reading, articles we recommend, all that kind of good stuff. You can also get access to bonus episodes and the ability to join the democracy, which votes on our next Patreon topic. We just released the previous episode, the last patron-sponsored topic, which was on the philosophy of psychoanalysis. So we'll be running a new poll fairly soon, so make sure you get over to patreon.com/owlsatdawn if you want to contribute to picking the next patron-sponsored episode.
Yeah, and we have a new bonus episode that should be live actually right now by the time that this one is done. So not only is there a back catalog, but there'll be a bonus episode, and this one is on what? How do you clarify? What will it be on?
We haven't even recorded it yet, so you're talking about past tense about things that don't even exist. Are you like a B theory of time type guy? What are you doing here?
I mean, what is time anyway? Really?
We're going to talk about something. Let's put it that way.
Something topical. That's what we're going to talk about.
Yeah. It involves a topic.
It does involve a topic. Cool. But also, as we have said, that if you leave us a review, we'll go ahead and read it out and we'll address that on air. What is it? How does it work again? If you leave like a 5-star rating and then a review and you ask us a question in the review, then we'll read it out and we'll address it on air live. Yeah, dude?
Pretty much. We have access to like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If for some reason we don't answer your question on air, it's probably because there's been a glitch somewhere. So just hit us up on Twitter or wherever and remind us to do that, because we'll absolutely do it if we see it. So with that in mind, we do have a new review from Apple Podcasts from Cheeseman15, or I guess he also says his name is Josh from New Zealand. This will be a quick one because Josh asks, his question for us is whether we've discussed on the pod, have either of us ever read much of Mark Fisher's work? For he is someone who really resonates with Josh's perspective in the world, and he'd be keen on our quick thoughts on his philosophy, particularly capitalist realism, but also Gothic Marxism. And so I wanted to point Josh to our previous entire episode on Mark Fisher that we did way back in the day. And that you can look that up and listen to it. And you'll get not only 2 minutes of talking about Mark Fisher, but like an hour and a half. So episode 25 was the one where we talked
Holy
about...
shit, that was a long time ago.
Yeah, man, long ass time ago. That was January 19th of 2017. 2.5 years, almost 3 years ago. So yeah, episode 25 of Owls at Dawn, Fisher of Men, is about Mark Fisher right after he passed. And so we talk a lot about capitalist realism and I think a little bit about Gothic Marxism too in there.
Yeah, I think at the Vampire Castle thing too. You know, I guess a collection of his works came out posthumously about like I think it's the old K-punk like blog, and a lot of like unpublished stuff came out. And I haven't been able to flip through it, but it's one of those things that's kind of on my constant to-do list that I would really like to spend some time with looking through some of those essays. So I know that's out there too. Have you looked into that at all?
No, I haven't. That sounds fun.
Yeah. Just don't have enough time to consume everything that I want to consume. After all these recommendations that Dean gave us, after all the stuff that I've got to do for my current research, and then, of course, the stuff that I just want to do, the stuff that I just want to read, I just need to download the shit like Neo does in The Matrix, where he's like, I know Kung Fu. Like, I just want to be like, I know K-Punk's back catalog. You know, just fucking download that shit.
Yeah, then you wouldn't really get the experience, though.
Yeah, I mean, I'll still take the time to like struggle through other texts, but I just want the pure, I don't know, reception of information that I just don't have time to receive, you know? But I can have both. I can struggle through the dense philosophical texts, but when it comes to like other stuff, popular fiction and maybe more like popular political writings, I just want to download that stuff immediately.
Yeah, I get that. What you want is just infinite time.
That is what I want. Maybe when we get to heaven, Troy. Maybe that's what heaven is in my world. Just
what's that
adequate
great
time.
Line? Heaven's a place where nothing ever happens.
That's right. Literally. The nothing happens in heaven. Huh?
You're like doing like a Heideggerian afterlife here?
Yeah. All right, let's get into the show.
All right, so you know what we got to do before we do anything else, dude?
What is it?
The shitty minute is what it is.
Yeah.
That's the part of the episode where one of us rants and raves about whatever it is that's grinding our gears this week. So, Austin, what's got you down?
Are you on TikTok? I think I know the answer to this.
Oh, God. What do you think the answer is?
I think you're TikTok famous, Troy. You and your Paul Dano looks, I think that you would be a star on TikTok.
Yeah, definitely.
So I've recently gotten into TikTok in the sense that like I flip through it. I have a TikTok now.
I know because you've been sending me videos.
Yeah, I've been sending you. Come on, and how funny are those fucking videos?
Oh, they're pretty great, yeah.
Honestly, I laugh so hard when I scroll through. It's pretty fucking funny. So, in a sense, I want to say that this is not a shitty minute. This sounds like it's going to be a sticky leaves, but here's where my shitty minute comes in. There's something on TikTok that I find to be so icky, and I just don't know if this is a cultural phenomenon. I mean, I have some theories about this, where it's like some more structural, systemic theories about this, but I just kind of want to throw it out there. But it is the clamoring for fame, and it isn't subtle, and it isn't the mantra that I kind of always tried to operate by, which is act like you've been there before. It isn't that at all. There is nothing cool, there is nothing nonchalant about TikTok at all. It is people asking to be famous. It is people asking to be TikTok viral. And I find it so odd. Now, TikTok is a very young app, right? So for this, if there are people out there that aren't familiar with TikTok, it's a very like Zoomer generation app, I would say, or younger millennials. But there's like a slew of videos where they're making fun of people who are old. And you know what the threshold is for being old on TikTok?
25?
25 is old on TikTok. So then you have a group of people who are all like over 25, like 25 to 26, 27-year-olds who are like, I know I'm old, but I'm on TikTok. And I'm like, what? Like you're embracing the idea that you are old. And then, of course, there's the over 40 TikTokers. And then there's the over 30 TikTokers. And they're all like, where are my over 30 TikTokers at? Let's all become friends and shit like that. So it's really strange. But the point is that it's a very young app. And so what I wonder is this like a symptom of like Instagram, Snapchat culture, but now in Zoomer generation, that whereas maybe Instagram was, you weren't explicitly asking to be famous, but nevertheless, you took your belfies and you did your like topless selfies and you did your like posed pictures at the concerts or whatever so that you would become viral. But then with TikTok, all of that subtlety is thrown out the window and it's just like pleading and begging to be famous. And I can't, dude. I don't like it. It makes me it's so cringe to use a word that I probably shouldn't be using because it too, is a Zoomer word. It's a TikTok word, apparently. I mean, I know other people.
It's cringe for you to say that, dude.
It's cringe that I use cringe. But I just can't do it, man. And I'm somebody, for people who don't know, I am somebody who grew up like in the acting world, like always trying to at least entertain the idea that I would be famous, right? And it wasn't until I had my radical conversion into Christianity, before my conversion out of Christianity, but my radical conversion into Christianity, which is what pulled me away from the acting world. I was living in Hollywood, you know, and like I called my agent the next morning and I was like, I'm done with this. So I'm talking about somebody who my whole life was, I thought I was going to be rich and famous. I was in a rock band. I was doing the acting thing. Like I wanted that, right? I just wanted to like bang models and be famous and shit like that. So I get the desire for it, but the way that I went about it was never like, pick me, pick me, pick me. But TikTok is all about that, and I just can't, dude. It hurts my heart. It hurts my soul. So I don't know if this is like a generational thing, if this is a cultural thing, if it's a technical thing. I don't know what's going on, but
you know how like there's this sense that a generation always hates something about the like aesthetic nature of the next generation.
Yeah.
But we always told ourselves that no, we're too enlightened to do that. Like we're going to understand why, you know, Zoomers are the way they are. And you know, maybe we won't like necessarily engage in it, but we're not going to judge it. We're not going to like be disgusted by it because those are all irrational, emotional responses. And we're rational, enlightened individuals. And so we're not going to do that. We were wrong because I'm aesthetically disgusted at some of this stuff and I can't stand it. And I want to make moral judgments about it, knowing full well that I really am not justified in doing so, but I'm still gonna.
Yeah, I feel like it's a moral wrong to ask to be famous.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And you got to just, come on, man, be cool.
Yeah,
like,
dude.
There's something about being cool that is stupid and worthless and you shouldn't care about it, but you should also not care about it in a cool way.
That's right.
There's like a meta cool about it.
You have to work really hard at being nonchalant, you know? And then that will give the facade that you don't care and that you've been there before. And the act like you've been there before mantra should be your mantra. But
yeah, motherfuckers, I read Infinite Jest, the whole fucking book. I get the new sincerity movement. I am for the new sincerity movement in many ways, right? Like I'm into that stuff.
Yes.
But you can also go too far. Sometimes you gotta hold some stuff in. You know?
That's right. You gotta be mysterious, man. There's no mystery. That's what it is. There's no fucking mystery. And that's why they're not fucking. And that's why everybody's single and they're complaining about being single and they're not fucking because it's the mystery that makes it so that like the people attract and want to bang. You know? I figured it out. There's a libidinal problem with TikTok. That is the issue.
Yeah, you're probably wrong about the sex thing, but I'm going to go with it because it fits the argument.
Oh, but yeah, man. But I will say this. With that said, with like my skin literally crawls when I see how like eager people are to be famous. With all of that, I honestly have not laughed as hard as I have as like just scrolling through some of this shit on TikTok, man. Like it's ridiculous. I was hanging with a friend the other night and we just were like laying down, just scrolling through the fucking feed, or the page, the For You page. And we were just cracking up at some of the shit, you know? And then there are some pages that are just fantastic, like Lad Bible. I mean, it's just a pretty funny company anyway, but their TikTok page is great. It is fucking hilarious. And I don't know, man. It also, with all of this being said, it also does reveal the ubiquity of creativity, which is another issue as well. I think there's like some interesting points of tension here. It's interesting to see how many people are creative. It's interesting that creativity and that people being creators has become like this ubiquitous category of what it means to be like a human in late capitalism, but then simultaneously does that kind of like degrade artistic expression? Does that degrade what creativity is? I don't know. Like, does it cheapen it and that it all just becomes like digital creation and it's mimetic and, you know, so I think there are like two ways that you can analyze, or multiple ways, but there are at least two ways that you can analyze this as being a good or a bad. But it is interesting just to see how fucking creative people are, you know, and how funny people are. Like everyone's funny. It's fucking weird, man.
The best part of the internet is that every joke that exists in the world you get to hear about, like all the best ones. Like that's just such an amazing opportunity, you know?
Yeah.
Like you remember back in like 2010, 2011 when Twitter was just great jokes one after the other and that was it. It wasn't just like a continuous hellscape about how the world's ending.
Mm-hmm.
But just like creativity and just pithy little tweets over and over again. I remember like one of my favorite parts of the whole internet and the history of the internet was this guy named Doc Funk. And he used to, I think he worked for the government because he like went on some like CAA black ops shit and disappeared from the whole internet. But he used to make memes about NBA basketball. And they were the funniest shit you ever saw. And he would just do like every single game, get pictures and make memes out of them. And he was just the most hilarious person. He had this whole running gag where Hito Turkoglu, who was a Turkish basketball player for the Orlando Magic back in those days, who now like works for Erdogan and is like a traitor to like the world. But he used to like make this joke that Turkoglu had a love affair with the basketball. And I shit you not, every single game that Turkoglu played, there was a camera shot that the NBA or whatever would post where he would look at the basketball like he's looking at a long lost love. Every single game. And this guy found all of them and had these new little memes he could make out of them. And they're just like, holy shit, man. Like, people can spend all their time doing this dumb shit, which is so funny and so creative, and I can enjoy it. This is the most brilliant like technology that's ever been created.
Yeah.
That's the part of the internet that we have killed.
That's what TikTok is, though, man.
But their snippet, it reappears like the gopher, right? It reappears every once in a while.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and I think TikTok is kind of that. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so popular too. There's like a pure positivity in TikTok. It's very rare that you get people that are like critiquing politics or that are like angry. You get more of like positive build-up affirmation kind of stuff that is socially and politically geared, but you don't often get like, I mean, and there's like, of course, the depression element as well, but even that is still affirming, and it's like very encouraging where people come along and they're like, yeah, we're all kind of struggling through what it means to be human in late capitalism, except it doesn't have that like political element to it. It's just much more like, yeah, do you, and we love you. So there's this positivity element to it, which can both be good and bad, but it is just very like edifying. It's upbuilding rather than like where Twitter is just like fucking negative. I can just feel the snark and the like sarcasm and the anger and the bitterness and the resentment on most tweets, you know? Whereas you don't really get that with TikTok.
Yet.
You
don't get it yet.
Yeah. So yeah, that's it. Act like you've been there before, motherfuckers. All right, sweet. So our guest for this week, as I said at the top of the show, is Dean Detloff, who is a junior member at the Institute for Christian Studies, who specializes at the intersection of religion and leftist politics. And he's also the co-host of the Magnificast, along with Matt. And is it Bernico? Is that what his last name?
That's right.
Bernico. And Matt was maybe going to join us this week, but he's not feeling so great. So send your love, prayers, whatever it is that you do out to Matt as well. But it's a great podcast for those of you that aren't familiar with it, so you should check that shit out. But welcome, Dean.
Yeah, thanks. Good to be here. And yeah, Matt sends his regrets. He would love to be here too, but unfortunately, just feeling down, under the weather.
I hate when that shit happens. I had a question. So you kind of come from a Catholic background, or I guess you're still Catholic, not even from a Catholic background. Does he come from an evangelical background?
Yeah, like we both had kind of like a weird stay in evangelicalism, I guess. And Matt, his brand of it growing up was part of like the Church of the Nazarene, and he is he teaches at a Methodist school, or is kind of involved in some ways in a Methodist tradition now, so adjacent to evangelicalism, but more kind of like in a more mainline sort of Protestant thing now.
Oh, gotcha. And I mean, I don't know if this is putting you on the spot, but I kind of just corrected myself a minute ago, and it's kind of interesting. I don't know, there's the term ex-evangelical that is really common online. I mean, what would like a lapsed, I mean, because you have a lapsed Catholic, but what would like a Catholic who is still Catholic but kind of goes hardcore left? I mean, do you just call yourself a Catholic, or do you say like I'm an estranged Catholic, a heterodox Catholic, or
I'm a regular old Catholic. I go to mass and I hang out with nuns and priests and all the rest of it. And the Jesuits pay some of my bills. And it's it's definitely weirder to be a lefty type Catholic in some ways in Canada or the U.S. But at the same time, there's literally millions and millions of lefty Catholics around the world who are probably more lefty than I am even. So it's a big church.
Yeah, I mean,
That's the genius of the word Catholic, right? I mean, it's infinitely fungible.
Right.
That's right.
If you're an evangelical, you gotta like evangelize. You gotta like show your faith and shit like that. Like you kind of put in a little bit of a box. But Catholic, you can just do whatever you want with it for the most part.
Yeah, I mean it's a little more complicated, but yes, there's much more elasticity, I guess, in the tradition than people often realize, I guess.
What about that social gospel, though? Like, see, the Catholics have this rich tradition of, being adjacent to or even sort of embracing communist, leftist principles. But, the Protestant church has Walter Rauschenbusch. Come on.
And even more, the Protestant church has full-blown communist pastors and ministers. Some of the most important... one of the most important communists in the history of Canada is this guy named Reverend A.E. Smith, who was a Methodist. He sort of slowly drifted away, but he was a radical social gospel guy, and lots of more interesting stuff going on in Protestantism too than people sometimes realize.
Totally.
So I know that Protestants talk about the fear of people who return to Rome, right, as being like this Protestant move into Catholicism. Is there a similar weird term or fear for Catholics who turn to Protestantism to save their faith?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, there are like whole ministries within the Catholic Church that their whole, shtick, I guess, is like trying to bring people back home to Rome or whatever. And
will they call that stealing sheep? Something like that?
Maybe. I'm not sure. Yeah. I mean, when I kind of like took a break, is how I like to say it, from Catholicism and kind of went into some other Christian traditions for a bit. Nobody seemed to mind. And when I came back, it was kind of like people were like, "Oh, we didn't know you were gone." So I'm not sure. The pressure is there in some places, but thankfully not the kind of Catholic circles that I find myself in.
God, that prodigal son motif just haunts me as a specter perpetually. Like I think I'm still perceived as the prodigal in most of my family and I'm sure my background and friends. We both went to a private Christian university for undergrad, which is where we met. So I'm pretty sure all the people that follow me on social media and maybe some of them that listen to the podcast would view me as a prodigal that is just always at the edge, that hasn't quite reached, that point of squalor where I'm laying with pigs and shit like that. But one day I will return. Yeah.
Well, you never know. I also went to an evangelical undergraduate school, so I know the type for sure. And I think, having gone back to Rome, there are some who probably still see me as a prodigal in that sense too, waiting for me to go back to, I don't know, Jesus camp or something, but too late. I'm not going back.
We had a friend in undergrad named Dave who got really into liturgy and got really into kind of the Catholic ceremony, but also the Orthodox Church when we were, but then I think he didn't go fully all the way, and so what he kind of embraced was more like high church stuff, like Presbyterian, like OP kind of stuff, Orthodox Presbyterian Church stuff for people listening, like that kind of thing, or like the PCA or something like that. Whereas, I don't know, I've actually kind of been feeling a little bit of that stirring as well lately. Troy, did you ever have that?
Yeah. I had a time where I was reading Orthodox theologians and getting them to talk about the Trinity nonstop, and everything's about the Trinity and Trinitarian relationships, intercession, all that stuff. So, yeah, I had that for a time.
Yeah. Dean, what do you think?
I think everybody who does like academic theological work and is coming from an evangelical background where there's none of that stuff starts to yearn for it a bit.
Yeah, what do you think it is? Like, why do you think we yearn for it a little bit?
What do you think, Dean?
Yeah. It's a good question. I don't know.
Psychoanalyze our Protestantism.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. I mean, my situation was a bit strange because, I grew up Catholic. Like my parents were Catholic, but they were like very chill about it, I guess. Like to this day, I'm the only person in my family who goes to any kind of church regularly at all, let alone, the Catholic Church. So I think for me, it was just like, I got to a point in my life where I kind of felt, for a number of reasons, if I was going to keep on being invested in Christianity, I would just sort of go back to the place I came from. And, there's less paperwork that way. But yeah, I don't know, like my own experience of being an evangelical and being surrounded by evangelicals for a significant amount of time, I think that, if you take the time to think really, really hard about Christianity, eventually you're going to discover that actually just the Bible in you or just Jesus in you isn't quite enough. And like, in fact, there are lots of people, for a couple thousand years who have been thinking really hard about that, and they didn't seem to come to the same conclusions that evangelicals did. So at least in some respect, I imagine, at some point you kind of start to feel a certain disconnect between the things that you're being told that you should think about in evangelical Christianity, like reading the Bible and thinking about, your relationship with Jesus, and then also going and seeking where other people have done that before you. And yeah, it's hard to maintain that for very long, I think.
Yeah, there was strangely a lot of the people I think we talked to in our own evangelical circles used to use that same logic as evidence for why evangelicalism was special and unique.
Right.
I remember one seminary student, I think, telling me one time that he was so perplexed and amazed at how the second generation from the apostles already had everything wrong. And that he's so glad that he's been shown the light that even they were incapable of seeing, even though they were so close to the apostles. And that that was actually, he wasn't being ironic. It sounds like you're saying that ironically, right? But no, that was actually an evidence of his uniqueness, of his faith, which was amazing to me.
Yeah, I mean, Dean, do you know the Bible Answer Man, Hank Hanegraaff?
I do. Yeah, not personally, but yes.
Oh, know of him, I guess. But, he recently converted and came out as Orthodox, yeah?
Huh.
And this was a huge fucking scandal. Like, there were journal articles written, Christianity Today pieces about how he had fallen away and that he's, like, rejecting the faith and that... Because, Protestants oftentimes view even Catholics as not being saved because you worship Mary and you worship saints, and so you're idolaters.
Right.
And so it's kind of like this traditional slide into a type of polytheism or something like that. It was really interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. I hadn't heard that, but that is very fascinating.
Yeah, I know. We used to hear that all the time, and I'm so glad that you brought that up, Troy, that little anecdote, because I used to think that, right? I used to think that, that's why the Dark Ages were the Dark Ages,
right.
Because, God had lifted his hand, but then, of course, Luther and Calvin come, and they reclaim the centrality of the Bible, and so then God's grace, his common grace, then sort of flows more freely because we've reclaimed the quote-unquote truth of the gospel, and that had cultural benefits and things like that, which is why America was so blessed, because they were Protestant, not Catholic. But if you look at Catholic Europe, they're the ones who got ravaged by the Black Plague and shit like that, and that was all a consequence, right, of kind of God's hand being lifted because people were turning away from it and just worshiping the church, the Pope, Mary, etc., etc.
Yeah,
so.
The confirmation bias knows no bounds. Yeah,
yeah, a little bit, man.
I had heard, plenty of the Protestant historiography about Catholicism, but I hadn't heard the thing about Hanegraaff. Yeah, that's really fascinating.
It's pretty new, yeah, Troy. Within the last 2 years, I'd say.
What is
the Hank Hanegraaff's conversion to Orthodoxy?
I'm actually not sure I'd even heard of that. Maybe I had. I have like an inkling that I heard that. But
yeah,
I can't remember.
Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, without us just sitting here pondering over the confusions that have existed in the history between these things, Dean, you wrote a pretty rad little article recently, and it caused a little bit of a shitstorm online, I guess we could say. Yeah?
Yeah, you could say that.
So, can you tell people about America Magazine? And then about what your piece is called and what you kind of put forth as a case.
Yeah, so America Magazine is a Jesuit publication. They're based in New York City, really historic magazine. People like Dorothy Day have written for it in her lifetime, and Herbert McCabe, and all kinds of very significant folks. But I write as a journalist for them pretty regularly, but it's mostly reporting. And to make a really long story short, somehow it so happened that they allowed me to write this feature article for them that wasn't so much reporting, but kind of just making, they titled the article The Catholic Case for Communism. Not my headline, but it grabs some attention, I think, I hope. Mm-hmm. And so my editors kind of took a chance on it, and it was an amazing thing. They had written an editorial to accompany it, saying that for America's whole existence, they were largely an anti-communist publication, or at least, not exactly pro-communist by any stretch, and they're not now. But in any case, they were saying, we're at least kind of allowing this voice to be heard, or this opinion to be heard in the pages of the magazine. And it was a real kind of, affirmation of their commitment to dialogue and to saying that Catholics do have a wide range of opinions about capitalism and also its alternatives. And I think that's great. Lots of people are kind of doing the all sides thing, and sometimes that drives me up the wall. But kudos to America Magazine for actually, I guess, finding one of the sides that isn't usually included in that all and allowing me to articulate it. So I wrote this short article about communism and just kind of trying to make a certain appeal to why Catholics in particular have some reasons to maybe give communism a second look, and also bring it to our attention that, in fact, historically, many Catholics have already called themselves communists or participated in communism around the world. And it's important that we at least find a way to understand that and enter into that. And I admit in the article that I myself am a communist and a Catholic. And as you said, that created a certain amount of buzz around the internet.
Yeah. What was like the most typical I guess 2 or 3 points of backlash that you experienced?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of tropes about communism and a lot of really convenient anti-communist lines that people are able to recycle without a whole lot of effort, and those definitely come out. For instance, like the body count of communism is always a thing that comes up, and people say, how could you possibly argue for this thing in light of
100 million people?
Yeah, exactly. Just some kind of number that ends up standing in for all kinds of historical things. So that's like one thing that always comes up. The second that usually comes up is that communism is a materialist or an atheist kind of philosophy, and how foolish you must be to not realize that, or something. And the third is the Catholic Church on a number of occasions has either distanced itself from communism or explicitly denounced it or condemned it in certain papal exhortations and that sort of a thing. And so, how could you have missed this? So those are kind of the 3 things that usually come out. But yeah, most of the time it's just an excuse for somebody to, write a column about how much they still don't like communism.
Yeah, it's so interesting. The body count argument, and I'm sure Troy can back me up on this. We used to hear it all the time. I mean, I used to do a lot of street preaching and evangelism myself, and I guess short-term missionary stuff. So you get into these conversations all the time, and I think we were kind of taught. I was definitely taught to use this argument, and we tied the body count argument to a kind of metaphysics, right? That communism is a materialist philosophy. And because it's a materialist philosophy, it doesn't have any moral grounding, using, I guess, the C.S. Lewis moral argument for the existence of God. And so therefore, because there's no metaphysical grounding for right and wrong, then you can justify anything insofar as it maximizes your ends or whatever. And therefore, you can murder a bunch of people and it's fine. That is why we need to have some kind of moral metaphysical foundation. That's why God's law, or that's like proof of God's law, that God's law is actually there because we think of these horrific things as being horrific. Therefore, God must be real, objective morality and objective truth must be real, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the argument kind of flows like that,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that definitely comes out, right? And there's always a one-to-one correlation, which conveniently ignores, obviously, the many, many bodies that have, fallen at the hands of people who do presumably have good metaphysics or something. But, it's a tough thing to get that point across.
They were backsliding, Dean.
I don't know about you guys, but I've never known anybody to have perfect metaphysics who wasn't also perfectly moral. So...
Oh God, I know. So what were some of the positive things that you got back, or maybe some of the surprising things that you heard?
Yeah, I mean, I did receive, I should say, some actual physical hate mail in my mailbox, which is a pretty wild thing.
Wow.
But thankfully, also, I received a lot of really interesting and kind of, I don't know, people like coming out of the woodwork responses, like some like extremely old communists sent me a bunch of emails about how they just thought it was an amazing thing that the Catholic Church was interested in this kind of dialogue in especially in North America in particular, excluding Mexico, the US and Canada. That was really, really interesting to kind of hear some of those perspectives. And even among certain Catholics too, some people had defended the article in interesting ways by saying, look, I'm not a communist, but we can't really deny that this is one position that is motivated by a certain moral imagination, and shouldn't we see if there's, points of contact or kind of Venn diagram relationships between these two things. And some of those people who had kind of been willing to go there, I guess, had surprised me, and I was happy to see that there was room for some nuance in that conversation, and that's really what I think ultimately had hoped to accomplish with it.
I think once someone says, I'm not a communist, but the spirit's basically softening their heart.
Yeah.
Troy, did you have anything in particular that you wanted to use to dive into the article, or anything that you wanted to bring up initially?
Yeah, I mean, this might be something I wanted to address later, but might as well go for it now. The kind of byline, or like the first line, at least, of the article, you quote Dorothy Day saying, "It is when the communists are good that they are dangerous." And I love that you started with that, because this is called, the editors called it a Catholic case, or the Catholic case for communism. But it seems like, as much as there is references to sort of like the Catholic religious case for communism, it's also really essentially a moral case for communism. It kind of almost takes those as being equivalent, or at least coming to the same conclusion, or like extensionally equivalent or something. And I wanted to kind of get your thoughts about how you thought the Catholic case and the moral case were, in some sense, are strongly related.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, you're right. I appeal more to kind of moral arguments, or at least some kind of intuitions that I hope other people share. That, when you hear, for instance, that like Jeff Bezos is the richest person in the whole world, but like people who work in Amazon warehouses are forced to like urinate in bottles. Like I'm hoping when I mentioned that anecdote in the article, that I'm appealing to somebody's kind of moral intuitions that, okay, there's something wrong here, and it's true. Like I don't appeal to a whole lot of specifically Catholic things. There is a moment when I draw some parallels between the Communist Manifesto and some things Pope Francis has said. But it's that appeal to Dorothy Day in particular that I think I was looking to have a way in. She's on the way to canonization. She'll be a saint soon. And it's like, well, if she is kind of willing to have this interesting perspective on communism, and even willing to develop herself, then shouldn't we at least, think twice about what we think about communism and what we think it could be, etc. So yeah, I personally, I wouldn't want to elide Catholicism and moralism. There's lots of people who are, morally good or morally better than many Catholics that I know, all that kind of thing. But just by virtue of the context and where it appears in America Magazine, it's important to kind of draw on that Catholic imagination and try to invite Catholics to reconsider things using, I guess, their own moral intuitions and these Catholic authorities that they think are really important, like the Pope or Dorothy Day.
Do you think it'd be correct to say that in any sense in which there is a Catholic case for communism, that Catholic case is also essentially moral, even though the moral scope is probably bigger than just the Catholic case?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, what would be, it would always be difficult to say what's the Catholic X or Y, because Catholicism is a huge thing. It's more than what a bishop says or a layperson says or even what the Pope says. It's a tradition in motion, always in motion. And I wouldn't want to say something as loose as Catholicism is whatever a Catholic says it is. I don't think that's true, but I do think that the Catholic Church is, not just what the most conservative pieces of it say that it is, or something like that. And so all traditions are these things that have to be negotiated, and things that you're also intervening in all the time, whether you say that you are or not, whether you admit it or not. And so in some ways, I guess this is sort of like my Catholic case for communism, and I'm drawing in parts of my own imagination that are formed by this tradition, and I think resonant with it, and extending it, and hoping that maybe that connects with someone else who's also Catholic or could, not Catholic too, but just people who share those similar kinds of like traditional significant points of reference or something like that.
That's pretty interesting. I don't know how it is in Canada, but in America, I think it's in the Constitution that the most conservative member of a group gets to define the nature of it.
That's right.
It's interesting too, because there almost seems to be like an insurpassable point of tension between some like hard-lined materialist Marxists who want to eschew any morality whatsoever from the Marxist critique of political economy, and then the argument that you're making, which is kind of like, I almost feel like what you're saying is, hey guys, I'm not making a universal argument for communism. I'm trying to introduce these ideas to people who are already inclined in a particular moral or ethical bent, right? And then what I wonder is that would you not get maybe a hardline Marxist that would read your critique and be like, this is just total moralism, and Marx was contrary to moralism. Like, he's absolutely critical of the moralism of religion, and all critique begins with the critique of religion kind of thing. So I wonder, like, how would you navigate that supposed gap?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, one thing that I think is kind of interesting about my own relationship to Marxism is I became sympathetic to Marx by first encountering the earlier Marx, which is Marx's earlier writings are full of like very moving prose and very appeals to moral sensibilities. It's not that Marx is necessarily a moralist, but he is trying to get you to, like, his rhetoric is trying to get you to judge a situation under capitalism as immoral, or somehow, an affront to what we should think is good, even by, bourgeois standards or something like that. So in that sense, I have a soft spot for thinking about Marx and in a kind of moral framework. But that being said, now that I'm down the road quite a ways in terms of my participation, even in Marxist groups, I these days, I think my participation in a Christian tradition, very broadly construed, gives me the kind of moral formation that I find really useful. But when I read Marx, and especially when I read something like Capital, I'm not really looking for moral arguments. What I'm looking for is how these pieces go together. It's the scientific kind of project that sometimes I think calling Marxism a science is bad, but where it's good is to say what Marx is trying to do is actually say, all right, I hope that you feel like capitalism is bad, but look, this is what it's actually doing. And when you look at that, like, that's rough. So I don't get into that in this piece because, it's trying to do something and appeal to a certain readership. But in my own kind of like my own participation in the Marxist tradition, it's the not moral parts that kind of really get me going, or the things that I find really valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how far I would take this, but I like to make a distinction between morality and ethics. And maybe I'm splitting hairs, but I guess I would say that morality tends to be tied to some kind of absolute or metaphysical singularity or point from which everything issues, whereas ethics can be opened up broadly. I mean, Nietzsche's system is an ethical system, even in Beyond Good and Evil, right? He's still thinking about how should we think through things, how should we understand truth, how should we organize life, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that, for me, I'm 100% okay with thinking of Marx as always, even from his first essay where he writes about the union of Christ, right, all the way through to the unfinished works of Capital, as being an ethical system. Even if we also want to add that maybe there's like a romantic morality that's present in the early works that kind of dissipates a little bit. But he's expanding on a lot of the works of classical political economy, which is thoroughly ethical. The division of labor, the critique of the division of labor, is an ethical concern based on based on Marx's critique of Adam Smith's conception of what this does to create efficiencies. And then in Marx's term, it not only creates efficiencies for capital, but it also kind of fractures, if you will, the romanticism of the craftsman, right? So there is a kind of romanticism even in that critique of political economy. It's just, like you say, it kind of takes more of an analytical turn,
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's totally fair, right? Like, Marx wouldn't care about how capitalism worked if he didn't have a political interest and also an ethical interest. He's not like a mathematician kind of abstractly working out the pieces. So yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. The moral piece for me, I guess, is just like, you can't walk into a room full of Catholics and be like, hey, here's what Marx thinks about commodities and like expect people to listen, right? Because like they won't. I wouldn't either. Like,
Yeah,
that's
but have you
extremely
tried
boring.
though, Dean?
Yeah, exactly. But you know, maybe you could get someone to say, all right, well, don't you think that this situation in front of you is something that you don't like? And hey, why don't we think about how there might be reasons that that's like it? And it's not just because bosses are bad people or good people. It's because bosses are compelled to act in certain ways because the way, you know, the economy works. So, yeah, it's all about strategic steps along the way, I guess.
I'm curious, Dean. I know that in Catholicism, there's a strong tradition and strain of sort of communitarian thinking. Do you ever get any pushback on the idea that you don't need to have this sort of secular materialistic philosophy to marry to Catholicism in some sense? That's just a weird marriage, and instead you should go back to like communitarian strands of thinking in Catholic history to get sort of similar result? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, there's lots of folks trying that from a number of angles, and you know, some are better than others. But for me, it always comes down to like, I can understand the appeal of some of these things. Like when people look to the Catholic worker, for instance, which is a truly amazing thing, a truly amazing phenomenon in the world. Not everyone does this, but some people, when they engage that tradition, what they like about it is that it is a radical tradition that is decidedly not Marxist, or, you know, it's anarchist in some ways, but it's ultimately looking at like the Bible and the Catholic tradition more than it is looking at Proudhon and Kropotkin, even if they, you know, want to read those folks. And my kind of response to all that is usually just the same as, I guess, my general kind of disagreements with things like anarchism or things that aren't Marxist, I guess, to be frank, which is, you know, these are some good judgments, but at the end of the day, like the scale of capitalism as we know it today, which is, you know, a system that is destroying the whole planet, that's the scale of that problem is not going to be solved by these small communities of these different ways of life, beautiful though they are, and as good as they are. You know, like, I don't think people should like quit doing them or something. But at the end of the day, we don't really have time to like convince everybody that Catholic social teaching is the right way to go or something like that. And even if we did, we would still be left with the contradictions of capitalism. So that's kind of the general response in a nutshell for me, I suppose.
Well, I'm offended, and I feel like Troy contacted you ahead of time and said that you were going to talk shit about the thing that makes my soul stir, which is that I want to go live in my intentional community in the mountains and start my hipster homebrew cigar smoking home church. But no.
I mean, go ahead, but just know that capitalism is still going to be out there, ready to get you.
Yeah, I honestly, and this is kind of more of just me venting frustrations, is I constantly am struggling between this issue of kind of like the universal and the particular, maybe, right? And I know that the bifurcation of those two is maybe itself a false bifurcation, and that they're obviously, even in like proper Hegelian terms, that the realization of the universal comes through the particular, and that there's an instantiation of the universal in the particular, right? The singular universal kind of thing. And so one of the things that I've been kind of maybe in my post-evangelical turn, what I've been really interested in is how to kind of think through, okay, you've got the universality of like a critique of political economy in a Marxist or post-Marxist frame, but then simultaneously you have like post-colonial theory, right? And post-colonial theory oftentimes can be accused of being overly particular, but without the kind of pitfalls of what you're talking about, like the anarchism, intentional community kind of thing. But it can focus on the particular, sometimes to a point where it can just be pure deconstruction and fracturing, and it doesn't seem to have the ammunition to really address the kind of more global set of concerns. And that's kind of where my mind is right now. And I don't really know, I don't really have any like settled thoughts on this, but I'm kind of working through that point of tension, because in my soul it does stir when I think about, you know, being in the mountains and fishing and hiking and that romantic vision. But at the same time, you know, I think I would feel an immense amount of guilt if I did kind of unplug, you know, because I would be kind of detaching almost from that kind of more universal element. And so for me, there's like kind of almost like a moral or ethical demand that I feel like is constantly haunting me as well. I don't know if you guys feel that.
Yeah, I mean, universality is a wild thing because universality is so often an excuse to exclude other people.
The particular, right?
Yeah,
which is why like the post-colonial theory has intrigued me, because it, we had George Ciccariello Marr on here in his book Decolonizing Dialectics, but it's precisely critical of the Eurocentrism of the Hegelian universality, right?
Right.
But then you can kind of go to the other end. I did a bonus episode for this podcast, and I spoke at a book launch a couple weeks ago for a book called Pluriverse, which is all about like post-developmental theory, and it draws a lot on post-colonial theory, decolonizing capitalism, etc. And it can sometimes veer into that just radical fracturing, that deconstruction of the global per se, the deconstruction of like, the sustainable development goals and things like that. And then in so doing, it can kind of just leave you with what we talked about previously when we worked through a book by Sergei Prozorov called Passive Nihilism, where it's just all you have are individual local communities and voices, but that there is no universalizing singular point that allows us to create a true global politics. And that tension is, it's so difficult for me to work through.
Yeah, it's a tension for all of us. It's the question of the moment in some ways. But I think for me, it always comes down to the good Marxist point is people come together in the struggle. That's where I don't know if I would call it a universality, but like there's an equalization of things that happen when people are struggling for liberation. Obviously, Marxists are interested in the class angle of that, but I think every good communist is worth their salt, and there are a lot of them that are not. But the good ones do recognize that it doesn't take away from the communist horizon to talk about the specific oppression that women face, or indigenous folks, or people of color, all that kind of a thing. Like these are all pieces of a system of exploitation. The biggest question is, okay, if we address these other kinds of inequalities, and we absolutely should, at the end of it, we at some point are going to have to talk about how to organize, how we work. And that's where I think Marxists can help. But it doesn't do us any good to sort of presume that like the Marxist analysis of class is ultimately going to be the one thing that finally obliterates all the bad differences in the world. To me, that's kind of a repetition of exactly what's bad about Christianity in many respects. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Troy.
Okay, I have a question. It's kind of general, and maybe it sounds more pithy than it actually is, but it sounds in some sense like we've been talking a bit about what Marxism and communism can do for Christianity or for Catholicism. Do you think that there's also something that Catholicism or Christianity in general can do for Marxists, communists, or socialists?
I love this question, by the way.
You would, Austin.
It's a good one.
Because it's ambiguous.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question I think about a lot because I have one foot in both of these spaces. I think on the one hand, yes, and on the one hand, no. I'll start with the no. Where I don't think that Christians can contribute something unique is in presuming that like you have to be a Christian, or you have to think in a Christian way in order to be like a true communist, or think about liberation in a true ultimate sense. I have my suspicions about that kind of move, which happens a lot. But on the yes side, what can Christians contribute to this kind of struggle? A kind of recognition of the many different ways that people can be humans in a liberated situation. There are Christians in communist states and communist situations who have done a lot of thinking themselves about this. K.H. Ting is a bishop in China. He died not long ago. But this was one of his primary concerns was, I live in a supposedly liberated zone of this place. What does it mean to be a Christian here? That's different than what it means to be even a liberation theologian in Brazil, and certainly different from what it means to be a Christian participating with communists at a protest in Canada or something like that. And I think, these are all kinds of things that Christians are going to have to figure out in the midst of all those struggles. At the end of the day, for me, what at least helps me in terms of being a Christian in these kind of spaces is an attention to the least of these, always a preferential option for the poor, as liberation theologians say it. And that's something that sometimes even Marxists can lose sight of. Liberation theologians are looking for who's being the most marginalized in any society, whether it's a capitalist or a communist one. And communists need that. Like, they need, people who are helping them find out who's slipping through the cracks, even in supposed liberation movements. So without being antagonistic necessarily to the process of liberation, I think liberation theologians and Christians in particular can, I hope anyway, contribute a kind of helpful attention to the outcasts and the poor and despised and that sort of a thing.
One of the things that I think is so kind of interesting that bears on this, though, is precisely in articulating what does it mean to be a Christian, right? And one of the things that I kind of appreciated about, particularly, probably at least from what I can, from what my old research when I did my master's degree was on Latin American liberation theology, or my dissertation was anyway. And Jose Miranda was kind of the most radical of the figures that I looked at. You got Gutierrez and Boff and others, and I mean Camilo Torres maybe as well, since he literally died in the armed struggle. But in terms of like theology, Miranda was pretty radical because, and this is totally paraphrasing, but he kind of says that God is justice, and if there is no justice on the earth, then that means there is no God. And it's kind of this almost theology of the future where it's like, but God might exist if justice comes to actually manifest or bear itself on the planet. And so what I kind of always took from this is that he's opening the door for a very sort of existentialist type of understanding of what it means to quote unquote be a Christian, and that in order to be a Christian, it's just based on what you do, and that there is no real like essence maybe of what it means to be a Christian. And so even like what can Christianity offer Marxism is that they can kind of meet, if you will, at that point where they are both practically oriented towards actions that are in contest to oppression, exploitation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so then when you kind of pause, it's never like, I am a Christian. It's just like, we talked about this with Peter Rollins, who was a guest on our podcast, this kind of idea that he's like, yeah, sometimes I'm a Christian, like when I help the poor and when I take care of the needy, yeah, then I'm affirming the resurrection. And sometimes I'm not, like when I'm ignoring the homeless person on the street, or when I kind of engage in this types of practical activity that is shitty or contrary, if you will, to both the Christian spirit's preferential option for the poor and the communist spirit that is like seeking some sort of contestation or critique of the capitalist mode of production. And I think that there's something maybe kind of there that's like a convergence, that it's just simply about what you do, and that maybe we shouldn't concern ourselves so much with identifying some sort of essence of what it means to be a Christian.
Yeah, I'm definitely sympathetic to that. One concern I sometimes have is Christianity is like a world historical religion. And because that's the case, it's never like the best of our hopes, I guess you could say, or like if you, what's the best way to put this? Like when you participate in existing in a settler colonial society like Canada, for instance, you're also being a Christian, but it's like bad. Like you're doing bad Christian things.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's totally that ambiguity that Christians have to take on. I affirm what you were saying earlier, Austin, about trying to, hear from these kind of decolonial voices. And my concern sometimes with people who say, yeah, I'm being a Christian when I do what's good and right and just, is that, well, I hope that that's true, but also you are being a Christian, or you're carrying on certain Christian ways of being unjust in other aspects of our life. And yeah, to live in that ambiguity is very important, so that we don't disavow what's bad about our own, or what kind of forms of violence are done in our own traditions.
I really like that. Yeah, because you don't want to absolve the signifier of Christianity from these other things, because then you end up essentializing the signifier, right? And you, I think I actually really like that. I hadn't thought about that. I guess I kind of do have that tendency to essentialize and to absolve it, and kind of like almost exalt Christianity as being the word that is the indicator of all that is good, and that we're always just falling short of it, right? but even that is already too kind of dogmatic, you know?
Yeah, there's some great work on this done by a theologian named Marika Rose, who wrote a book not too long ago called
Theology of Failure.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book, but she attends to that, and so does this guy Anthony Paul Smith that she draws off of too. And they both have this they use this term called weaponized apophaticism, which I really like. Which is basically, you're always negating Christianity in such a way that it never has to take responsibility for what it has done in the world. And for those of us who still want to participate in Christianity, it's important to make sure that we're not doing that. I think anyway.
Yeah, we worked through one of Dan Barber's books on this podcast, and he's kind of in a similar. He does a lot of work, obviously, with Anthony, and I don't know if he does work explicit with Marika, but I know that they run in similar circles. I actually did. Anthony and we did graduate school at the same place. He was doing a PhD with the guy who was my master's supervisor, Philip Goodchild.
Yeah.
So,
That's awesome.
Yeah, Anthony's work has been really good. I know he's done a lot of work recently too on Islam, which is another thing that I just, Christians have such a skeptical view of Islam. Right. And it's so interesting when you kind of have somebody who is a scholar of religion who can kind of bridge that divide as well. And that's just one of those areas that's a total blind spot, I think, in my epistemological framework that I think would be so important to kind of consider further, not just is there like a radical sense in which Christianity can help us, contest oppression and exploitation and maybe ground us in some sort of normative frameworks, but what about Islam as well? How does that fit into this? How do Christians reconcile the fact that we all kind of come out of this monotheistic, Abrahamic set of concerns? And that, I don't know if you've done much thinking on this, but that for me is just completely outside my wheelhouse, really,
Yeah, it's a lot. Much of my graduate work is kind of looking at some of these things, but the thing that struck me most or brought this problem home to me in some ways was I was at a protest, 4 or 5 years ago in Toronto, and it was about, it was a water protector protest. And so it was led by Indigenous folks trying to really, call the country of Canada and all people around the world to account for what we're doing to the planet. And I was so intrigued because of all the speakers who spoke, there were many faiths that were explicitly represented. So someone would come up and they would say, as a member of this nation, this is what I think, and etc. Or as a Muslim person, this is what I think. And there was one union leader who spoke, and whether or not he's a Christian, I don't know, but he didn't appeal to his faith, and he's the only person who didn't mention a faith tradition there. So Christianity was not represented at all among these people, and it got me thinking because I thought, well, there are actually plenty of actually really good ecological activists in this city who are Christians, but there was something significant about kind of tacitly recognizing in this context of protest that we're also protesting something about Christianity and how Christians have thought about the world around us for a long time. So yeah, all that to say, I think it's important for us to figure out where Christianity does and doesn't show up, and how to think with and against it if we're interested in being part of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's kind of a strain of thought that I don't know that there's an analog in the Protestant or evangelical side. The kind of thinking with but also against strain. What is it about Catholicism, if I'm right about this, that allows you to do that in a way that still like can fundamentally hold on to the Christian identity?
Yeah, being a Catholic is full of antagonisms. There are many Catholics who think that they don't have the luxury of okay, if you're an evangelical, like we were saying earlier, it's just you and the Bible, right? And you have that kind of simplicity, and so everybody else must be wrong because you have this kind of anchor point. There are people in the Catholic Church who kind of try to do that, but even they can't point to just the Bible. There's a whole weird tradition full of bizarre people that are like saints and popes and all the rest. And so to be a Catholic means affirming all kinds of things that you actually don't want to affirm, whether you're like a progressive or a conservative. And I think that like Pope Francis, he'll say things one day and I'm like, thank you for doing that. I'm very glad that you're the Pope. And then the next day he'll say something about, I don't know, like trans people or something. And it's like, buddy, like you don't have to do that though, and the fact is, like, I go to church every Sunday and I pray for Pope Francis every Sunday. And, it's, you've got to accept and live with all those antagonisms all the time. And like I said, people try to deny that or cover over it, but I think there's something about just recognizing that it's completely imperfect. Like, even if you pretend that it's perfect, you get pissed at all the people who say that it's not, and nevertheless, you're stuck with them, like they're in the pews next to you. So I don't know if that's a fundamental difference, but it's certainly, in my own experience, having traveled through evangelicalism and Catholicism, there's kind of, like, you just can't deny that it's really hard. It would be extremely hard to maintain a purity narrative about the Catholic Church if you think for any amount of time about it.
Yeah, it's interesting that not necessarily just in terms of purity, but something I really always admired about like rabbinic and Judaism is the I don't know how the joke goes. It's something like 3 rabbis, 4 opinions. Right. So there's always this kind of constant antagonism and kind of embedded humility about what you can really know and how consistent can you really be and how much of the truth can you really have, while still allowing that antagonism to exist within a kind of holistic identity that's consistent.
Totally.
Yeah. And that just, I don't know, there's something that I find really esteemable about that, probably because the evangelical circles we swam in our early years just absolutely thought that was anathema. That just kind of thing was evidence of untruth. If anything else. There has to be absolute certainty.
Yeah, the evangelical church has to create like a perfect, linear, consistent, almost like logical formula that begins from Genesis.
Laughably so. Yeah.
Right, and it's so interesting. So, Dean, I sent you this, and then Troy, I know you know about this, and then for the listeners out there, I'm doing a read-through of the Bible from now this like post-evangelical, after years of doing philosophical, political, economic study, whatever, and I'm kind of like returning to, because I haven't actually read the Bible in probably about 8-9 years. I mean, I've read excerpts and books on the Bible, but I'm talking about just sitting down and reading the Bible, right? And so the goal is to read through it in a year, and I'm in halfway through Genesis, a little halfway through Genesis, and I have been laughing hysterically at, I think, what are some very self-aware rabbinic teachings. I mean, Jacob's name is he cheats. The guy whose name gets changed to Israel's name is he cheats. He's a fucking trickster, man. He lies to Esau. He engages in some lies with Laban. Laban's father fucks with him. Like, his wives are like, here, bang my servant because, I'm having like a competition to see who can produce more offspring. Like, I feel like that's really funny. And there's a lot of like unethical things. God is a trickster in Babel when he comes down and is like, well, fuck these humans. I don't want them to coalesce and have a grand strategy because they'll be able to do anything. I'm going to go down and confuse their tongue. Like, these are all elements of like the trickster God, which I think is a self-aware recognition that there is a sort of tension, that it isn't just this pure ethic, this pure metaphysical, moral consistency that you get in evangelicalism, but that you get this much more paradoxical, kind of confusing element of the rabbinic style of teaching. And I can almost imagine like some students sitting around going, but wait, teacher, like, are we supposed to lie and like fuck over people so that we can just get our birthright or get our blessing or whatever? And then they're like, no, but this is a perfect point of tension where we can teach, And it's a real interesting kind of paradox or contradiction, no?
Yeah. I mean, I think the real strength of so many traditions that rely on interpretation and put a big premium on interpretation is exactly that. Even if you want to freeze something and say, well, this is the root text, or these scriptures are the scriptures that we're paying attention to, the minute that you have to start talking about them, you're already gonna, introduce some complications.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that about both every religious tradition does it, whether they admit it or not. But I appreciate the religious voices who are capable of kind of affirming it and driving it home or really leaning into it.
Yeah, because it does. It creates that point for, to use like either a Socratic term, or maybe we could even talk about it in Hegelian terms, but it creates a point for like dialectical revelation or dialectical transformation or dialectical progress or dialectical synthesis, right? Where you can start to say, no, there are these points of tension, but then let's unpack this. Let's engage in an ongoing discussion. Let's engage in an ongoing struggle, which again, Israel means, one who is striven with God and one who is striven with men. That's why Jacob's name is changed. So again, there's almost like something inherent about that dialectical struggle that is inherent to, I think, the kind of constitutive fabric of this thing that we end up becoming we end up calling the Christian tradition. But I feel like Protestantism oftentimes, in the Orthodox settings at least, loses that, where it does feel like Catholicism is a little bit more comfortable. I mean, that's why you have like these Roman encyclicals and these Vatican councils, and maybe there's a sense to try to homogenize, but it seems that it's still, in a grand historical sense, still working through something as being processual, right? There's this processual element to it.
Yeah, I mean, I should say, like, having said all that stuff about how we should own how bad Christianity is, the Catholic Church does do a very bad job of affirming pluralism a lot, right? And, we're responsible for all kinds of, as you said, homogenization is a good word, at least the attempt to do that all around the world.
Right.
But, like Vatican II, for instance, the big Vatican Council, for people that don't know, the Catholic Church had like a big meeting and they decided to change how they feel about all kinds of things. That was a huge moment of affirming that we are a dialogical tradition and it's actually time to dialogue with the rest of the world. And I remember talking to my dad one time. He lived through that. My dad was born in 1936, so he'd been around. And I asked him what he thought about it. And he said, before Vatican II, all the mass was in Latin, and then after it was in the vernacular in English. And he said, yeah, it was like really bizarre, like extremely weird to all of a sudden hear all this stuff in English, and there were many other liturgical changes too. But he said he had asked his dad what he felt about all these reforms, and his dad had said one time he heard that the church was relaxing these restrictions about eating meat on Fridays for like certain groups of people during Lent. And he said, sort of jokingly, but also seriously, well, what are they going to do with all the people in hell who, had already broken that prohibition or whatever? And there's humor there because it's just
no takebacks.
Yeah. Well, and being a layperson, I think, is actually sort of like it encourages you to have a little bit of ironic distance from what the hierarchy says or does, because the history of the church is not as neat and tidy as some people would like it to be. And yeah, at least, like I said, Catholicism doesn't necessarily inculcate that in people, but I think that for me anyway, it's like incredibly therapeutic having gone through evangelicalism to now be part of a tradition that is, messy and can't really hide that very well. Yeah,
and I appreciate that you said, Dean, that an important point is everybody or every religious tradition already does this process of interpretation, right? The key is whether or not you're honest about it, you're authentic about it, right? Otherwise, you end up with what evangelicals do, right? Which is refuse to ever admit that there's legitimate interpretation going on. Instead, it's just transference from the Holy Spirit, right? Which is absolute, certain, and guaranteed. And then you get stuff like, Left Behind and, political organizations that are vying for the, end of days and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there's just a profoundly different metaphysics of God in both the Protestant tradition, let's say particularly the American evangelical strain of it, and the Catholic tradition? Like I don't know. I was actually going to ask you, Dean, what you think about this. You said you go on Sundays and you actually pray for Pope Francis. What is the God, or who is the God, or how is the God that you are praying to? Is it a God that is processual? Is it a God that checks all the boxes of typical proper theology proper, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, et cetera, et cetera? Is God a being? Is it like vital force, elan vital? Like, how do you conceive of the metaphysics of God? Because, and it depends on the Protestant tradition, but like at least I spent definitely more time, and I think Troy did as well, in the Reformed tradition. So the Calvinist, Lutheran tradition, where really it's God's will that becomes preeminent, right? And, there is no free will because God has chosen everything, determined everything from eternity past. And, there's this kind of stasis about the essence of God. But then I got really into like process theology and process philosophy, which is probably explains a lot why I'm like a Deleuzian and Bergsonian now, and maybe even why I was attracted to Sartre for doing, previous research and whatnot. But this idea of process is something that I'm more attracted to now. But how do you conceive of God, like metaphysically?
Yeah, dang. I am not a theologian. I should say that off the bat. I try to be theologically literate, but I'm not a theologian.
Sure.
And,
This is why you should be a Protestant, Dean, because then everyone's a theologian.
Well, this is what's so great about being a Catholic, though, is we don't have to think about this stuff as much. When I was an evangelical, I felt so concerned about getting that question exactly right. Like, who's out there and who's listening and how, and it's obsessive in some ways.
Yes.
But now I
feel seen.
Yeah, I feel more chilled out about it. I don't know, like, who's God? I guess Jesus is supposed to be God, and you're like, you hear that story every Sunday, different bits and pieces of it when the gospel is read, and you're just supposed to think about that. Like, all we know about Jesus or about God on earth is what's revealed in Jesus Christ in terms of Christianity, and I think that, like, there's something really provocative about that. Like, when you hear Jesus doing something weird or saying something that you wouldn't expect, it's like, okay, well, that's supposed to be some kind of revelation of who God is, so I'll think about that for a bit, but I'm not gonna, or at least I don't have the skills to kind of systematize it. I will say, though, talking about being Reformed, so the school I go to that you mentioned at the top of the show, the Institute for Christian Studies, comes out of a Dutch Reformed tradition, and it's a very idiosyncratic one, but there's a professor here named James Olthuis, Olthuis, and he's an incredibly beautiful person and theologian, but his whole thing all the time is just God is love. Whatever you think about anything else, God is love. And what that means is, like, complicated. He himself also is like a practicing psychotherapist, so he knows quite a bit about the dark sides of love and all that too. But I really feel like that simplicity and complexity of saying that God is love is kind of, when I get around to thinking about it, that's what I think about.
This is an underrated aspect, I think, of the anxiety that evangelicalism can induce in you. Evangelicals like to say that Catholics believe in works salvation and they believe in grace or faith salvation, right? But then you do a little bit of work in epistemology and philosophy, and you realize, belief is actually really hard to get right. In fact, it'd be a lot easier to just do some set of like works rather than actually get the belief right. Because then you got to get all the content of the belief right, including the nature of the God you're believing in, what it means to believe in something. There's a whole lot of stuff you've got to get right. To feel like you're in a good place before God under evangelicalism. So there's definitely a lot more work to be done, I think, there than there is in other traditions.
Yeah, I should say, too, it just occurred to me, I also feel very strongly about God being a judge or having some kind of power of judgment. Again, like, what that means, I don't really know, but I feel so incensed by how the world operates sometimes, and I feel very, like, I guess at the end of my rope about, like, what to do with it. And I come from a family that's, like, it was fine growing up. Like, my parents are really great people, but it was really in spite of kind of where they had been. And I won't go into all of that, but, like, I feel, I look around at things that have happened to people that I love and care about and things that are still happening to them, and I just think, like, none of this stuff is going to get accounted for on this side of eternity. So, like, I really take comfort thinking that maybe at the end there's going to be somebody who, figures it all out. Like, this person is got to, spend a few more years in purgatory or whatever, I don't know, but, like, there's somebody on the other end who's counting everything up and keeping it on the scale. And even my own, like, I would like to be judged for the things that I have done wrong, and I want to have a chance of, I guess, being held accountable for those things, as painful as it might be, because I do think there's something so frustrating about the inability to see justice done in the world today. And I feel strongly that if there's a God on the other side, I hope that God is able to judge the situation with truth and figure out what to do about it. And I hope that that's the case.
Do you draw much from the mystic tradition at all? Like even like more contemporary, like Henri de Lubac or Henri Nouwen or anyone like that. And then of course historically there are obviously many throughout the centuries as well. But do you kind of draw positively from that at all?
There are some kind of mystical voices I'm really invested in. I really enjoyed learning a lot about this woman, Marguerite Porete. She had been killed as a heretic, unfortunately, but she was an amazing person and wrote a short book called The Mirror of Simple Souls. And her work basically got picked up by Meister Eckhart. And everything that you think is cool that Eckhart ever said is actually from Marguerite Porete. It's true. You heard it here first. She deserves to be recognized for her contribution. So I'm really invested in her, or at least I was for a while. But in terms of contemporary mystics, one of my favorite and to this day most significant theologians for me is Ernesto Cardenal, a Nicaraguan priest. He was a revolutionary during the Sandinista Revolution. He took up a spot in the revolutionary government and was famously disciplined by Pope John Paul II, and then also famously rehabilitated by Pope Francis just a couple of years ago. But he's an incredible poet. He's one of Nicaragua's most famous poets, and his vision of just how the world works and how God works and all that kind of stuff. Like when I'm feeling like I need to have some kind of like spiritual moment or something, or like I'm feeling dry, like I go to Cardinal and just figure it out that way. That always kind of brings me back up.
I'm so excited that I'm scribbling down resources. Yeah, that sounds amazing. I mean, do you think...
I'd never heard any of these people.
Yeah, I hadn't heard the bit about, what is it, Marguerite Porete?
Yeah, Porete, Porete.
I mean, I've read the shit out of Eckhart, and I love me some Meister Eckhart, but I did not know anything about this at all. Yeah, she deals with the works in divine love. Okay, that's amazing. I have one more question that I just wanted to ask you about, like Pope Francis in liberation theology. Mm-hmm. So Pope Francis, you talk about how he sort of reinstates Ernesto Cardenal, and so many people, like even just my friends who aren't religious. I was talking with a friend of mine the other day, and I mentioned something about liberation theology and Pope Francis. I mentioned liberation theology, and she was like, "Oh, is that the thing that Pope Francis is?" Right. So I think that people kind of they tie those two together. I kind of feel like that Pope Francis, he has some social leanings that I would say are progressive, that are definitely radical from, kind of certain compared to like Benedict, right? But do we think that he's a liberation theologian? Like, does he fit within that camp? Or, I mean, obviously it can be a broad umbrella term, and so there's a spectrum. I mean, obviously there's a difference between Leonardo Boff and Jose Miranda as well, right? But what do you think about how he sits within the tradition of liberation theology?
Yeah, I mean, the history of liberation theology in the church is a really complicated one because it emerges after that, or alongside at least, that thing I was talking about earlier in Vatican II, where the church kind of opened itself to this dialogue with the world. And to make an extremely long story short, after Vatican II happened, Pope John Paul II, his papacy in large part was trying to put the genie back inside the bottle in some ways. And he appointed Cardinal Ratzinger, who would become Pope Benedict, to be basically the head of theology police, more or less. And
otherwise known as the Inquisition.
Yeah, well, essentially. And the two of them, I mean, they were extremely suspicious of liberation theology, and it was for many reasons. Some may be reasonable, but most of them, I think, not. And there's been lots of good journalism about this that had happened at the time, about how they, these two and others, wielded a lot of institutional power in the church to quash liberation theology, and they couldn't because it wasn't just a bunch of theologians. It was a mass movement of people. In Brazil, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of base communities, like actual people getting together, living this stuff out. And by the time it got to somebody like Boff or something like that, or many of the bishops in Brazil who were quite radical, they were responding to what was happening in front of them just as much as they were trying to feed it. And I think seeing liberation theology as a mass movement helps us to understand Pope Francis, because living in Argentina, having lived through a dictatorship and having had a complicated role there himself, he too couldn't help but be influenced by liberation theology. And by the time he becomes the Pope, he is actively, I mean, this is a strong interpretation, but he is undoing many of the judgments that had been made by Benedict and John Paul II on people like Ernesto Cardenal. You know, he's rehabilitating people like Gutierrez and Boff, making them institutionally affirmed people, and that's huge.
Interesting.
Yeah, we all of us on the left want Pope Francis to be further left than he is, but at the end of the day, he is a politician in many respects, and he's very savvy at it, and he knows that he can't just come out, even if he wanted to say that Ernesto Cardenal was right the whole time, he could never say that without causing like a schism in the church. And so what he is doing is saying Ernesto Cardenal is a priest in good standing with the church, and that means people like me can go to someone like Cardinal and say, hey, look, this guy he's fine. Like what he says about Marxism and stuff like that, like we can talk about it and disagree and all that stuff within the church, but you have to take it seriously. So yeah, you know, the Pope Francis is a product of liberation theology. He's not the sum total of it, and he's one strand of it, but he is opening the door for the rest of us to continue that process that could have been shut down even further if we had gotten a very different pope.
I like that. Yeah. Troy, have you done much thinking about Pope Francis?
No, not really at all.
Yeah, me either. I feel like when he was, God, what's it called when you first become, you're not like ordained, elected, chosen, elected?
Yeah.
When he's first elected, I remember it being like all the progressives were like super excited about it, right? Because he was supposed to be the one who kind of comes out of this Latin American liberation theology tradition, and then I've kind of just. Maybe I've just read some more of like the kind of critical think pieces and stuff like that, and I haven't paid much attention. Obviously, my work and my interests have kind of like shifted away from theology proper, or even from like the confessional church more generally. And it's only been more recently, I'd say, within the last year that I've started to kind of come back to the fold. Maybe the prodigal son is starting to have a stirring. But yeah, I mean, I'd be really interested in doing more research into this. Like, you know, I don't know about a lot of the stuff that he is undoing. Is there like a website that's like Francis's website where he's like, here are my declarations and decrees? Like, how do you keep up with this other than just kind of being in that world?
Yeah, I mean, there is a Vatican website where you can
There
read.
is, okay.
Yeah, and it posts like everything, like not, you know, everything from his encyclicals to like a speech he gives in front of a bunch of fishermen in Italy. Like that was something that was posted recently. But yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of amazing Catholic journalists who are working really hard. There's America Magazine that I write for, they have some great reporters who do this. There's also the National Catholic Reporter, which is historically, I think, the best place you can go for this kind of stuff. If you were interested in the background of the policing of liberation theology, which I think really is important to get like the context for why Francis is more radical in some ways than he might seem. There's an incredible book I'm reading right now called People of God by a journalist named Penny Lernoux, Lernoux. You can read it for free on like archive.org, but it's a whole account of how liberation theology emerges and how it's attempted to be shut down. But in any case, like once you have an idea of that history, you can really detect the subtleties. Like when Pope Francis rehabilitates Cardinal, it's a huge deal because one of the most famous things that happened in the history of liberation theology is after the Sandinista Revolution, which Pope John Paul II did not like and was very clear about, despite the fact that it was an incredibly Christian project. He came to Nicaragua, got off the plane, and there's a famous photo of him. Ernesto Cardenal is kneeling before him to get a blessing. And instead of getting a blessing, Pope John Paul wags his finger at him. And he then forced him to take a choice, him and his brother, he was also a priest and in the government. They had to make a choice to either stay in the revolutionary government or quit the priesthood. And Ernesto Cardenal stayed. And that was in open defiance of what Pope John Paul II had said. So for Francis to then say, no, you're okay now, now that Cardinal is, quite old, is a very significant thing and something that, look, Pope Francis has a lot of reactionary opinions. I don't want to like give the impression that he's
sure,
of
like, course.
And I don't affirm those at all. But on these kinds of issues, it's important to see his historical kind of nuance. Sure.
Was Cardinal excommunicated?
Not technically, but not. I don't know. Like, okay. Many theologians were silenced, for instance.
Because I know Miranda, for example, was excommunicated.
Yeah, many of them were. Cardinal, he wasn't allowed to be a priest anymore. Which was heartbreaking for him.
Yeah,
and for many in Nicaragua. But yeah.
Troy, you got any final thoughts or questions or anything like that, so we can let Dean enjoy his evening, or go to bed, whatever it is that he's going to do?
Yeah, I'm just wondering when the prestige HBO drama adapting People of God's going to be, because that sounds awesome.
It would make a good one.
Yeah, who would play like the Pope and Cardinal? Can Benicio del Toro be in it? Because I just fucking love him so much.
Well, just the other day I tweeted, Fray Beto is one of my heroes. If you don't know who he is, you have a great evening of Googling ahead of you. He's a Brazilian priest. Famously had this great dialogue with Fidel Castro that was published as Fidel and Religion. But he's a Brazilian Dominican priest. He suffered under dictatorship, just an incredible liberation theologian. But I found this photo of him as a younger man, and he looks exactly like Fred Armisen. And I really want that to happen. I want a Fred Armisen biopic of Fray Beto.
It would have to be like this weird, like indie, awkward comedy. That I'm not sure that would work. Or maybe it would be like the tonally brilliant for doing it.
He'd be into it. Fray Beto, he's got a great sense of humor. I think he could do it.
That sounds fantastic. Well, Dean, thank you so much for coming on, man. This is just like I said, I have felt more of like a stirring lately. I'd say within the last year or two to kind of not neglect, if you will, my theology. I mean, I spent so many fucking years in theological training and in like the spiritual tradition and in spiritual pursuits, and then kind of went the philosophy route and political economy route. And one of the things that Troy and I kind of lament quite often on this show is how we feel like that there's oftentimes something lacking in contemporary popular politics. And I don't know if it's just because I don't have the resources to find something else, but my mind automatically says, well, there's like a spirituality that's lacking, or there's a metaphysics that's lacking, or there's like a normative framework, like a meta-ethical norm that is lacking, or something. And I feel like that there is a sense in which I don't know if I'm returning to Rome, so to speak, but that there is like a turning my eyes towards heaven, so to speak, or towards the kingdom, or towards a messianic vision, or a prophetic imagination. And so it's really been interesting for me to kind of think through these things and consider these things. And I draw a lot. For people listening, their podcast is amazing. They mentioned Marika Rose. They did an interview with her a month ago when her book first came out.
Yeah.
And they did some funny episodes on Halloween that were actually really good too. But it's a great podcast. Check out the Magnificast. But thanks so much for coming on and giving me more ammunition to complicate my own journey at the moment.
Yeah, thanks so much to both of you for having me on. Again, I'm really sorry that Matt couldn't be here. He's the funnier one of the two of us. Maybe next time. But it's great to be here. And I always say, being a Christian is great. At the end of the day, whatever gets you out in the streets, for me, it helps to go to Mass on Sunday, and that makes me feel like I can take on the rest of the world, and that's where I go. But everybody I organize with, I'm usually one of the few Catholics in the room, and I'm happy to be with them and happy to be at church too. So I'll see you out there, I guess.
That's right, man. That's right. I think we had a guy on our podcast early on, and he's actually my old basketball coach from high school, but his name's Tom Airy, and he was talking a lot about the kind of loneliness of how, because he comes out of an evangelical background, the loneliness of kind of having a more radical social gospel turn. And I was a part of a social justice church in LA, the last that I was living there in Pasadena, and those communities are few and far between, and I feel like a lot of times it can be isolating if you still have that Christian bent, because the Christian communities aren't radical enough, and then the radical communities aren't Christian enough, and then you kind of feel like you're torn oftentimes. And I think it's so important to find those moments when you can find nourishment, when you do feel like you're kind of floating between spaces,
Yeah. Well, on that note, I'm sorry to keep dragging out the ending here, but
no, that's good.
I would say, I spend a lot of time with people who are members of the Communist Party of Canada, and they come out of a communist tradition. And of course, most of them are not religious, a couple, but because of the tradition that they have, they're not only are they actually quite aware of liberation theology, but they're totally affirming of like being a person of faith in those spaces. And I know that the same is true of the CPUSA, the Communist Party USA in Tennessee. And I also know that the Communist Party in Australia has an incredibly deep history of Christian people being involved. And my guess would be you might find some fellow travelers or people who could at least kind of hear you out or whatever without feeling the need or compulsion to hide that part of yourself or not find it. In any case, that's been helpful to me in my own kind of geography.
That's great. Yeah, my eyes and ears are open for those communities. So cool. Well, sick, man. So where can people find you on the internet so they can track down your work and your podcast and all that other good stuff?
Yeah. So the podcast has a Twitter at The Magnificast. My Twitter handle's there, and so is Matt's. But my Twitter handle is Dean Detloff, DeanDetTloff, and I post everything usually on Twitter. So that's the place to find it.
Right on. Well, sick, man. Well, enjoy your evening, and hopefully we can catch up with you at another point in the future.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on, Dean.
Yeah, thank you.
Come on, I've got a day to discover you. Slaves getting paid, getting richer on days off.
All right, sick. Well, again, thank you so much to Dean for coming on and chatting with us. Tons of references, tons of stuff to think about. Got any questions out there? You can get in contact with him. And definitely tune into his podcast. They do tons of great episodes, and they're pretty frequent as well with releasing episodes, so they do really good work. But now we got to switch to our final segment for our episode, which is the Sticky Leaves. This is where one of us gets to recommend something that is giving us hope or meaning in a world that might be potentially devoid of such things. So, Troy, what is giving you joy? I made a rhyme.
You did. I can't believe this is the first time you've made that rhyme.
Seriously.
So my sticky leaves this week is going to be a simple one. I wonder if you even know about this. But my favorite record of all time is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. And I just recently read a couple interviews with the guitarist of the band and some podcasts of interviews with him talking about the 20th anniversary of this album. And so I wanted to bring it up because I'm not sure if I'd ever talked about this record or this band on the podcast because they're not the most popular band in the world.
Can I guess?
Yeah.
Is it Mr. Bungle?
It is.
Ah, yes.
Yeah,
yes,
Mr. Bungle's album California came out in 1999. And it's the weirdest. They're the weirdest band that's ever existed. Like up there with like the Residents and some of the other like weirdest bands you can possibly think of. And I would encourage anybody out there who has never heard of Mr. Bungle or hears that name and it's like, what the fuck are you talking about? To check out this record specifically, because it's definitely their least weird record. It's the most digestible and approachable of their records. It was their final record. It's been described before as Beach Boys on acid, which I think is a wonderful way of thinking about it. So this album, California, is a record that I had this wonderful history with this whole thing because I was a big fan of the band Faith No More, which I think anybody who like knows about early 90s like alternative rock and alternative metal knows about them. They had the famous song Epic, which was like one of the first examples of like rap rock, unfortunately, in the world. And Faith No More's vocalist, Mike Patton, was, before he was ever in Faith No More, was in Mr. Bungle. Faith No More was his side project, which would bring like chagrin to anybody who was a fan of Faith No More because they thought about it as being the opposite. And Mr. Bungle was absolutely much more experimental than Faith No More, to the point where Mr. Bungle actually got signed to Warner Brothers Records when Faith No More hit it big in 1990. And Mr. Bungle released 3 records on Warner Brothers, which are the 3 weirdest records to ever have been released by a major label. Absolutely. And it's wonderful because Warner Brothers basically gave them a guaranteed deal and spent tons of money making these records, which sold nothing at the time, at least. And so these records would never have been made if not for having been on Warner Brothers, because they're incredibly intricate, especially the last one, California. In fact, California is such a strange record because it's so unapproachable and so experimental, and yet there's points in the record where there are 70 tracks on a single song, and analog recorded, analog like tape recorded. So one of the interviews I was talking about that I was reading recently that made me want to talk about this was on the website faithnomorefollowers.com with the guitarist of Mr. Bungle, Trey Spruance, who's one of my favorite musicians of all time. And he talks about the recording process for this record and how absolutely batshit insane it was. So go read that article if you want to hear about some insane recording techniques for how they were able to, they had to like splice together different soundboards from different studios just to get enough tracks for some of these songs to be recorded. But yeah, Mr. Bungle's California, it's my favorite record of all time. I go back to it and hear new things every single time that I listen to it because it's that intricate and that well developed. If you want an easier intro to the band, listen to the song Sweet Charity. If you want some of the crazier moments and to get into that sort of intrigues you, listen to the song None of Them Knew They Were Robots, or Ars Meriende. Those are some of the great ones. And I should add, Trey Spruance, who's the guitarist of the band, is behind some of the lyrics and some of the crazier songs, which are some of his compositions. And he's very philosophically inclined. So he's got lots of like futurist and post-humanist themes running throughout a lot of the lyrics, which are not easy to decipher, but they're very fun if you enjoy reading any of that kind of like philosophical or quasi-philosophical literature. I should add also that in addition to that, that guy, Trey Spruance, his other band that he's been working on for about 20 years now is Secret Chiefs 3, who's another one of my favorite bands. And they are also an absolutely incredible band. He's really into like Middle Eastern, and we say Middle Eastern, but we mean like the kind of modes you would hear in just non-Western music. Probably a better way of thinking about it. And he incorporates a lot of rhythms and modes from non-Western music into rock-oriented instruments and electronics in ways that I think are really, really fun, especially if you've become a bit bored with kind of grid patterned 4/4 Western rhythms and, you know, basic 12-tone stuff. So if you get sick of Western music, but you really like rock music, check out Secret Chiefs 3. You might get something that whets some of your appetite that hasn't been wet before.
Let me ask you this. What is it about, like, I don't even know if I have an album that I could say is my favorite album. How can you be so committed to a singular album?
I don't know, man. I think there's something about just understanding. It's like thinking about like your best friend. Like, this is the album that means the most to me, and it's just very clear to me. Like, I have 3 records that are just by far the most important to me in the world: Mr. Bungle's California, Radiohead's OK Computer, and Sonic Youth's Daydream Nation. Like, no doubt, those are the records that would be on Desert Island with me that I would listen to forever and ever. How do you not have that?
Yeah, I don't even know if I have that. You know,
you're just a polygamist. That's the thing.
It's true.
You want to have like your dalliances.
Yeah, I know, and I think that's why it's hard for me. But here's the weird thing: like, if someone put a gun to my head and they were like, "You can only listen to one group for the rest of your life," who would it be? And this is such a cliche answer, but it would be the Beatles. But the reason is because I grew up with just that as the soundtrack of my youth. You know, Saturday mornings at my mom's house before I went to my dad's house. I went to my dad's house on the weekend, so usually, sometimes it was Friday night, but most of the time it was Saturday morning that I'd go see him. Saturday morning was jazz at my mom's house, and then when I would get to my dad's house, it was like Beatles, classic rock, so Who, Zeppelin, but then also like new wave stuff, Oingo Boingo, Tears for Fears kind of shit, because that was my stepmom. My dad was more like the rock guy, but Beatles was the thing that was always on. And like for me, my music education went through the Beatles, as I think it has with so many people of a particular generation, right? Which is going to be really interesting because subsequent generations, I don't think are going to have that, you know? Like maybe the Zoomers, they know the Beatles, but because their parents are like Gen Xers and maybe even like the older millennials what's their music education going to be? It's going to be really interesting to see. They're not going to have that, like, the hegemon of the Beatles being the quote-unquote greatest band in the world, right? It's going to be really interesting to see. But I think
there'll still be a lot of people that use Spotify to go back.
Yeah?
I've actually found a surprising number of young people through teaching that know a lot about music history, more than I did at the same age. And I thought I was pretty far ahead at that same age.
Sure.
So I'm hopeful that there's still going to be a vanguard of people who are into that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, so like the Beatles, I could say as a group, but if you ask me like a singular album, like, I don't know. I mean, Abbey Road is the one that sings to my soul the most. Of course, that's not the cool one, right?
Abbey Road's pretty damn cool.
I mean, I think Abbey Road's great, but it's not the White Album, and that's
the White Album is the best one.
That's what everyone. Yeah, if you're a music lover, you have to say the White Album, or you're like, you're a basic bitch. Well, I'm just a basic bitch, I guess.
You also have to say Rubber Soul's underrated.
Hard Day's Night is my favorite, bro.
And that Sgt. Pepper's is overrated. You have to say that.
Sgt. Pepper's is overrated, right? Yeah, exactly.
Here's the thing, though, dude.
Yeah,
There's a different. I think that the idea of a desert island album and the most important albums in your life are not extensionally equivalent. Like,
True. Totally.
They're different questions. And I think when people talk about desert island, they usually mean what's the most important to you. But it's a clever way of getting at that. But they have different outcomes, because talking about desert island, you're going to have to think about, what am I going to get sick of quicker, right? Like that matters. And any pop music's not going to make it at that point, because you're going to get sick of the hell of that shit. Also, probably no metal, because you're going to get sick of that shit.
But see, that's why, like, does it have to be a singular album, or does it have to be, can it be a group?
Yeah, so maybe you're looking for the more diverse group and the bigger output, which is not the same thing as what's the most important.
Right. Yeah.
So I do think that you have to. I think it's a more important question. Like what Henry Rollins talks about, like on your first date, you got to ask, like, what are your 5 most important albums and like 5 most important books. He has a great stand-up special on that. You should go listen to that out there on YouTube. Okay. Henry Rollins' first date or something like that. But yeah, if that's the question where you want to get at, like, who is this person? What can I know about this person's soul by asking one question? Like, that's the question, right? What are the most important albums in your life, and why are they important to you? Like, you can ask that and get a lot out of what kind of person someone is.
Yeah.
Also, if they've thought too much about it, like I have, huge red flag. Run the fuck away.
This person's neurotic. Cool. Well, that's sick, man. Yeah, I mean, I have attempted to listen to Mr. Bungle, but I got to be honest, I don't even think I've actually spent much time. I think I listened to it and I was like, holy shit, I got to be in the right frame of mind for this. So.
It's not the kind of music you can listen to and not pay attention to. That's for sure.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, fuck it. That'll be my soundtrack for the rest of the day then, as it usually is when you recommend music for Sticky Leaves.
Hope your rest of your day is full of like cocaine.
Yeah. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to read the Bible and listen to Mr. Bungle.
That's a chemical admixture I don't want to know what the product of is.
Yeah, I'm very curious how, like, my consumption of information or, like, any sort of, like, pursuit that isn't musical is influenced by the different music that I listen to. Like, if I'm listening to, like, hardcore music or post-hardcore music, how does that affect if I'm reading the Gospels?
What's going to be your music choice when you're reading the genealogies?
I don't. It's got to be like spoken word, maybe. Gil Scott Heron. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah. All right, sweet. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap up the episode there. Thank you all for tuning in to another episode of Owls at Dawn. Thanks again to Dean for coming on and chatting with us. Go check out his podcast. Check out his work. And you know where to find us. Twitter, Insta, you can email us, etc., etc. And I think that is pretty much it, as we're running kind of long here. Yeah, man, unless there's anything else you want to say?
Just one more thing, dude.
Oh, what is it?
Das Vidania, America.